Yellow Medicine Valley, Minnesota, October 1878. The air held the crisp, brittle promise of winter, a promise every settler took as a threat. Along the riverbank, where the sawmill's boneyard rusted in the tall grass, a man was doing something no one could understand. His name was Stanisław Wojtkiewicz, and he was attacking a dead giant with a hammer and chisel. The giant was an 8-foot diameter steam boiler, condemned and discarded. A great iron cylinder, thick-walled and silent, it lay on its side like a beached whale. For months it had been a landmark of failure. Now this quiet Galician immigrant was trying to cut a door into its flank. The ringing of his tools was a sharp, lonely sound against the rustle of dry leaves. Pearson Meacham, the mill foreman, walked over from the main building, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. Meacham was a man whose authority was forged in the same fire as the machinery he commanded. He knew iron, he knew pressure, he knew steam, and he knew failure. He stopped a few feet away, watching the methodical, seemingly pointless labor. "Wojtkiewicz," he said, his voice flat. "What in God's name are you doing to my scrap?" Stanisław paused, looking up. He was not a large man, but his shoulders and hands were dense with the quiet strength of a mason. "A house," he said, his English clipped but clear. Meacham stared at the boiler, then back at the man. He let out a short, sharp laugh that was more disbelief than humor. Other men from the mill, Silas Croft and Jedediah Stone among them, were drawn by the sound. "A house?" Meacham repeated, louder this time for the benefit of the gathering audience. "You're making a house out of a condemned boiler? Man, that's the most foolish thing I've ever seen. I condemned that shell myself. There's a cracked seam right by the firebox flange." "Is for family," Stanisław said, his gaze unwavering. He gestured with his chin toward the crude lean-to 100 yards away where his wife and 2 children lived. Silas Croft, a lanky farmer, whose own cabin was a model of traditional axe-hewn competence, shook his head. "It'll be an icebox in November and an oven in July. You can't live in an iron bottle, man. It's madness." Jedediah Stone chimed in, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near the boiler's rusted surface. "He's building his own coffin, Pearson. Come the first real freeze, they'll find him and his family stiff as cordwood in there." The men chuckled. The judgment was swift, unanimous, and absolute. The Galician was a fool. Stanisław Wojtkiewicz said nothing more. He simply turned back to his work, picked up his chisel, and struck the iron again. The ringing echoed across the valley, a sound of strange and stubborn purpose. What did this Galician mason, a man who knew more of lime kilns than log cabins, understand about thermal mass that the most experienced mill foreman in the valley had missed? This channel is dedicated to uncovering the lost wisdom of the frontier, where innovators used forgotten physics to survive against impossible odds. The story of Stanisław Wojtkiewicz and his iron house is one of the most remarkable. I promise you will learn a fundamental principle of heat that modern homes are only just beginning to rediscover. So subscribe, click the bell, and tell us in the comments, what's the most unconventional home you've ever seen? Stanisław Wojtkiewicz was not a frontiersman. He was not a carpenter, a farmer, or a hunter. In the old country, in the rolling hills of Galicia, under the shadow of the Carpathians, he had been a zdun, a master mason of ovens. His hands knew the language of fire brick and clay, of lime slaking in deep pits, of the precise curvature of a dome that would hold heat for baking, not for a few hours, but for a full day. His world was one of heavy, dense materials, river stone for the foundation, clay tiles for the hearth, and a strange, fibrous mixture of slaked lime and hemp shives for insulation. He understood that the secret to warmth was not a bigger fire, but a smarter wall, a wall that could breathe, and more importantly, a wall that could remember. He had arrived in Minnesota with his wife, Zofia, and their two small children, Jan and Aniela, the previous autumn. They came with little more than what they could carry, and a promise of land that was harder and colder than any story had prepared them for. Their first winter was a lesson in humility taught by the wind. They lived in a hastily built chinking shed, a structure of green wood and mud that was little more than a sieve. That winter had etched itself into Stanisław's memory, not as a single season of suffering, but as a series of sharp, distinct failures. He remembered the sound of the wind forcing tiny, hard pebbles of frozen chinking through the walls, peppering the floor like thrown gravel. He remembered Zofia's despair as the brine in their pickling crock, their only surety against scurvy, developed a slush of ice on its surface despite being inches from the stove. The most searing memory was the simple act of carrying a pail of water from the barrel by the door to the stove for heating. In the 10 feet it took to cross the room, a thin crystalline lid of ice would form on the surface, shattering with a tinkle as he set it on the cast-iron stovetop. His children, Jan and Aniela, slept in their coats, their breath pluming in the air inside their own home. He had fed the stove relentlessly, a frantic, losing battle against the indifferent cold. The wood he burned seemed to vanish into the air, its heat a fleeting ghost that warmed nothing but the space directly around the firebox. He vowed, with the quiet intensity that defined him, that his family would never endure such a winter again. That was the promise he was hammering into the side of a dead iron boiler. The failure of the standard frontier cabin in the face of a Minnesota winter was a known, if grim, reality. The problem wasn't a lack of effort or skill. Men like Pearson Meacham and Silas Croft were masters of their craft. They could hew a log with an adze to a razor-fine edge, notch a corner so tight a knife blade couldn't find a gap. The problem was physics. A log cabin, for all its romantic appeal and structural integrity, is a thermal disaster. A solid 6-inch pine log has an R value of about 7.5. In a place where the temperature could hold at 30 below zero for 2 weeks straight, that was like wearing a cotton shirt in a blizzard. The primary defense was the stove, a roaring source of convective heat that warmed the air. But air is a fickle container for warmth. It stratifies, rising to the ceiling, leaving the floor a landscape of ice. It leaks, pouring out of every tiny crack the wind can find around windows, doors, and imperfectly chinked logs. A conventional cabin didn't store heat. It merely rented it for as long as you could feed the fire. When the fire died down in the middle of the night, the house began to die with it. The temperature inside would plummet, reaching equilibrium with the outside world in a matter of hours. Families like the Crofts accepted this as a fact of life. Their winter routine was a cycle of intense heat and creeping cold. They would burn through 10, 12, sometimes 15 cords of oak and maple in a single season. Their evenings were spent huddled near the stove, the air around them shimmering with heat, while 6 feet away, frost would be climbing the inside of the walls. At night, they buried themselves under layers of wool blankets and buffalo robes, waking to a frigid house that required another furious burst of fire-stoking to become habitable again. This was the accepted method. This was the wisdom of the frontier. It was a strategy of constant, exhausting battle. Stanisław Wojtkiewicz was not planning a battle. He was planning a truce, brokered by a substance nobody in Yellow Medicine Valley had ever seen before. His work began not with the boiler, but with the earth. He chose a spot on a slight rise, where the ground was dry. He dug a shallow, perfectly square pit, 8.5 feet on each side and a foot deep. The local men watched, curious. They assumed he was preparing a root cellar. Then came the strange part. He didn't line it with stone or wood. Instead, he began mixing from sacks he had carefully guarded. Since his arrival, he took out two materials. One was lime, which he slaked with water in a barrel until it became a smooth, white putty. The other was a coarse, fibrous material, the woody core of the hemp plant, chopped into small pieces. It was called hemp hurd, or shivs. He mixed the lime putty, the hemp shivs, and a bit of water into a thick, lightweight slurry. This was the material of his old trade, the insulation he used to pack around the great Carpathian bread ovens. He called it wapno konopny. Here, they would one day call it hempcrete. He poured the mixture into the pit, tamping it down with a heavy plank until he had a perfectly level, 4-inch thick slab. It was porous, almost fluffy in texture, and weighed a fraction of what a stone or concrete slab would. Meekum, watching the process, scoffed. "A foundation of weeds and plaster? The frost will heave that to pieces by Christmas." Stanisław simply replied, "It must breathe." For a week, he let the slab cure, the lime slowly absorbing carbon dioxide from the air and turning back into limestone, locking the hemp fibers in a permanent, lightweight matrix. Then came the boiler. With a system of levers, rollers, and the grudging help of two other immigrant families who owed him favors, he maneuvered the multi-ton iron cylinder onto the center of his strange foundation. Now the real work began. With his chisel and a heavy hammer, he slowly, painstakingly, cut the rectangular opening for a door. It was brutal, deafening work. Each blow sent a shockwave through the iron. It was during this phase that Pearson Meacham delivered his most dire and specific warning. He walked up during a pause in the hammering, his face grim with professional concern. "Wojtkiewicz, I'm telling you as the man who signed the condemnation papers on this shell," he said, his voice low and serious. "I didn't scrap it for a simple leak. There's a hairline fracture in the seam weld, right near the old firebox flange. It's a stress crack from years of heat and pressure cycles. Now you're cutting a hole in the shell, weakening the whole structure. And I see you got a small stove to put in there. You heat this thing up, and then that Minnesota cold hits it. That iron is going to contract. The stress is going to find the weakest point, and that's going to be your new door frame and that old crack. It'll tear. Maybe just a little, but enough to leak stove gas, carbon monoxide. You and your wife and your children will go to sleep one night, and you will not wake up. This isn't a joke. You are building a gas chamber for your family." It was not mockery. It was a genuine, expert warning, delivered from a place of knowledge and responsibility. Any other man would have been shaken. Stanisław looked at Meekum, then at the iron shell, then at the hempcrete slab beneath it. He tapped the slab with his boot. "The floor will be warm," he said. It was the only explanation he offered. He finished cutting the opening and then, using a small portable forge, he brazed a heavy, custom-made iron frame into the hole. He hung a thick wooden door, carefully sealed with felt. At the top of the boiler's dome, he cut a smaller hole and fitted a stovepipe for the small wood stove he placed inside, ensuring the pipe was sealed tight against the iron. From the outside, it was a bizarre, alien sight, a huge iron tank with a single door and a chimney pipe, sitting on a pale, fibrous mat. It looked temporary, insane, and profoundly dangerous. To Stanisław, it was the fulfillment of his promise. To understand what Stanisław had built, you must first forget everything you know about heating a conventional house. You are not heating the air. You are heating the floor. The principle he understood from his work with bread ovens was thermal mass, and its crucial consequence, thermal lag. A massive, dense object like the clay wall of an oven or a thick slab of stone requires a tremendous amount of energy to heat up. It resists temperature change. This is its thermal mass. But once it is heated, it holds that energy for a very long time, releasing it slowly and steadily. This delay between absorbing the heat and releasing it is the thermal lag. A great bread oven works this way. You build a roaring fire inside it for several hours. The fire heats the thick masonry walls, saturating them with thermal energy. Thousands upon thousands of British thermal units, or BTUs. Then you rake out the fire and all the embers completely. The oven is now empty, but it is not cold. The walls, now a massive reservoir of stored heat, begin to radiate that energy back into the oven cavity. They will radiate a steady, even heat for 8, 10, even 12 hours, baking hundreds of loaves of bread with no active fire at all. Stanisław's iron house was simply a giant, slow-cooking oven designed for people instead of bread. The engine of the system was not the small wood stove, but the 4-inch slab of hempcrete beneath the floor. While it was lightweight compared to stone, the slab still had significant mass, over 2 tons of material. All day, the small, efficient wood stove would run, not to blast the space with hot air, but to gently feed heat downwards into the slab. The iron floor of the boiler, in direct contact with the slab, conducted this heat efficiently into the hempcrete. The slab was the battery. It spent 8 hours a day slowly charging. By evening, when Stanisław banked the stove with a single log to smolder through the night, the slab was fully saturated with warmth. And then, as the fire died down and the ambient temperature in the boiler began to drop, the slab began its work. It started to release its stored energy, pushing a gentle, steady warmth, perhaps only 60 or 65 degrees Fahrenheit, upwards through the iron floor. This reversed the fatal flaw of the conventional cabin. In a log house, the coldest part was the floor. In Stanisław's iron house, the floor was the source of heat. This created a gentle, radiant warmth that heated objects directly, not just the air. It was a fundamentally more efficient and comfortable way to live. Meacham's fear of the cracked seam and thermal shock was valid for a boiler being flash heated by a firebox. But Stanisław's system was the opposite of thermal shock. The heat was low, slow, and diffuse, rising from the entire surface of the floor. The temperature differential across the iron shell was minimal. There would be no violent contraction, no sudden stress to tear the old wound open. The house was designed to operate in a state of thermal grace, not thermal violence. The mockery lasted all autumn. The validation would come with the first deep cold. That year, the winter did not creep in. It fell like a hammer. In mid-January, a high-pressure system stalled over the Canadian plains, pushing a vast, heavy dome of Arctic air down into Minnesota. It settled into the river valleys, a phenomenon the old-timers called an inversion freeze. For 12 straight days, the temperature in the Yellow Medicine Valley did not rise above 20 below zero. At night, it plunged to 40 below. There was no wind. The air became thick, still, and crystalline. In the mornings, a dense ice fog coated every surface in a layer of feathery frost, a world rendered in white and silence. This was the cold that killed. It was a quiet, penetrating cold that found every weakness. For the settlers in their log cabins, it was a siege. The Croft family's cabin became a tableau of misery. They kept their stove glowing cherry red, but the heat seemed to have no effect. The logs were so cold, they acted as heat sinks, pulling warmth out of the room. The windows were opaque with an inch of interior frost. Silas was up 3 times a night to feed the fire, his family huddled together in one bed under a mountain of blankets. The air was a torment of extremes, scorching near the stove, freezing everywhere else. Inside the iron boiler, life was different. The small stove consumed a fraction of the wood the Crofts burned. It was fed steadily during the day, then banked for the night. The silence that was a threat to the other settlers was a comfort to the Wojtkiewicz family. There were no drafts, no gusts of wind forcing cold through the walls. The single greatest difference was the floor. It was never cold. It was a constant source of mild, radiant warmth. This small fact changed everything. Zofia found she could leave a bowl of sourdough starter on a low shelf, and it wouldn't die. She could set a pat of butter on the table, and it would remain soft enough to spread. These were small miracles, domestic luxuries that were impossible in any other house in the valley. The children, Jan and Aniela, didn't have to live their lives clustered around a stove. They could sit on a sheepskin rug on the floor and play with their wooden toys, their hands and feet warm. The air was still, the temperature even from floor to ceiling. On the third night of the inversion, Stanisław conducted a silent experiment. He took a single, unused tallow candle from their supply box. It was straight and rigid in the cool air. He placed it on its base in the middle of the iron floor, far from the stove, which was now just a bed of dying coals. Then they went to sleep, the silence of the great cold pressing in on all sides. The mill was suffering. The water in the flume that drove the great wheel was running slow, thickening with fragile ice. Around midnight on the 8th day of the freeze, it seized entirely. A dam of ice had formed at the intake gate. Pearson Meacham, woken by the sudden silence of the machinery, knew he had to act fast, or the backed-up water would buckle the structure. He needed a heavy 12-pound maul to break the ice, and the only one was in the workshed across the yard. He bundled himself in his thickest wool coat and stepped out into the night. The cold was a physical blow. It felt like breathing powdered glass. The air was perfectly still, thick with the shimmering particles of ice fog that hung motionless between the buildings. As he walked along the frozen bank of the mill race, his boots crunching on the brittle snow, he passed the clearing where the strange boiler house sat. He glanced at it, expecting to see a tomb rimed in white, but something was wrong. The ice fog, so uniform and stagnant everywhere else, was different here. Directly above the boiler's dark curved dome, the fog was moving. It was not a plume of smoke. The stovepipe was cold and capped with frost. This was the air itself. A slow, gentle, almost imperceptible column of air was rising from the entire surface of the boiler, pushing the ice fog up and away. The dome was creating its own microclimate, a phantom chimney of warmth, breathing steadily into the dead 40 below air. Meacham stopped, his own breath freezing in a thick cloud before his face. He stared, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he knew about heat and iron. A fireless iron shell should have been the coldest object in the valley. It should have been a magnet for frost, but it was alive. It was exhaling the memory of a fire that had died hours ago. He walked off the path, his boots sinking into the deep snow. He approached the boiler cautiously, as if it were a sleeping animal. He pulled off his thick mitten. He expected the searing, instantaneous pain of touching frozen metal, a cold that would weld his skin to the surface. He hesitated, then pressed his bare palm flat against the iron wall near the base. There was no shock. There was no pain. It was not warm, not in the way a stove is warm. It was simply not cold. The brutal, energy-sucking chill he expected was absent. The iron felt neutral, passive. It was the most profound thermal lie he had ever encountered. In that moment, his lifetime of experience with metal and heat was rendered obsolete. He walked to the door and knocked. The sound was flat and dead in the frozen air. After a moment, the door opened a crack. It was Stanisław, holding a small lantern. A wave of calm, even silent warmth washed over Meacham's face. It was not the dry, scorching heat of a cabin stove. It was a gentle, pervasive comfort. Stanisław opened the door wider, and Meacham stepped inside. The transition was staggering. His lungs, raw from the frozen air, relaxed. He saw Zofia and the children asleep in their bunks, breathing easily, not buried under a suffocating pile of furs, but sleeping under simple wool blankets. The air didn't smell of smoke or soot. It was just still, clean, and warm. Then his eyes fell on the candle. It sat on the floor where Stanisław had left it. It was no longer straight. The tallow had softened from the bottom up, and the candle had sagged under its own weight into a gentle, perfect bow, its wick pointing toward the wall. It had been defeated not by a flame, but by a promise kept by the floor. Meekum looked from the bowed candle to the sleeping children, to the quiet man holding the lantern. He finally understood. Stanisław hadn't built a simple shelter to fight the cold. He had built a machine to tame it. He looked at Stanisław, the quiet mason who had endured weeks of ridicule. The words came to him, drawn from his own world of machinery and forces. "You didn't build a house, Wojtkiewicz," Meekum said, his voice filled with a new and profound respect. "You built a pressure vessel for heat." The next morning, Pearson Meekum walked into his office at the mill. He took out the heavy, leather-bound boiler condemnation ledger. He turned the pages until he found the entry for Boiler No. 7, Franklin Iron Works, 1868. His own handwriting noted the date of condemnation and the reason. Hairline stress fracture at firebox seam weld, unfit for pressure service. He dipped his pen in the inkwell. He did not cross out his original assessment. It was still true. Instead, he made a new entry below it. He wrote, "Addendum, January 22, 1879. Boiler No. 7 salvaged by S. Wojtkiewicz for use as a dwelling. Structure survived 12-day inversion freeze at 40-degree Fahrenheit with minimal fuel consumption. Key innovation, 4-inch lime hemp insulating foundation slab acting as thermal mass. Heat from small stove is stored in slab and radiated through floor overnight. No thermal shock observed. Performance exceeds standard log construction. Recommend salvage of similar condemned shells for this purpose." That ledger was a formal document, a piece of industrial record-keeping. When the mill's quarterly reports were sent to the head office, a copy of the ledger went with them. The note about Boiler No. 7 was read not by homesteaders, but by engineers and foremen at other mills in Brainerd, Stillwater, and La Crosse. They were practical men who understood the language of stress fractures and performance reports. They also understood the high cost of scrapping a boiler. By the following autumn, 4 other families living near mills along the upper Mississippi were building their own houses out of condemned iron shells, following the strange specifications of the Galician mason, now recorded in the precise, unsentimental language of a foreman's logbook. The quiet revolution Stanisław started was a century ahead of its time. His intuitive use of a massive, insulated foundation anticipated the core principles of modern passive solar design and radiant floor heating. He was creating a high-performance, energy-efficient home from industrial waste. While his neighbors saw a piece of scrap iron, he saw the perfect conductor and radiator. While they saw a flimsy foundation of weeds, he saw a thermal battery. He understood that you don't survive a Minnesota winter by fighting it with a bigger fire. You survive by storing the energy of a small one and making it last. There is a simple truth on any frontier. The land does not reward tradition or reputation. It rewards what works. Stanisław Wojtkiewicz never sought to teach or to preach. He simply built a better way to be warm, and in doing so, he redefined the meaning of shelter. He knew that survival through a long, dark night depended not on the ferocity of the fire you built at dusk, but on the wisdom you built into the floor. Any man could make a fire that roared for an hour. The challenge was to create a system that remembered the fire long after the last ember had died. A fire that ends at dusk is a poor fire. Stanisław Wojtkiewicz had taught the floor to keep its promise to his family, to hold the memory of warmth in its very heart and release it faithfully, silently, through the coldest and deepest hours of the night. until the dawn. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. If you found this story of ingenuity and forgotten wisdom valuable, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more tales of frontier innovation. And let us know in the comments, what modern technology do you think owes a debt to this kind of old-world knowledge? The content of this video is for educational and storytelling purposes. It presents a fictionalized narrative inspired by real historical practices and principles. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are products of creative reconstruction. While the engineering and physics concepts are based on established science, any application of these or similar techniques today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety standards, and professional consultation. This video does not constitute engineering, architectural, or legal advice.